Let's talk about what's going on in Ukraine, because it's absolutely fascinating that Keir Starmer is under pressure to lift restrictions, particularly on Ukraine's use of Storm Shadow missiles, after Zelensky said that British support was slowing down. First, is it slowing down? And second, should we actually allow the Ukrainians to use those Storm Shadow missiles in Russian territory?
Yeah, good morning. It's always very difficult. We have to, Zelensky's talking not in his native tongue. What he actually means is that following the Ukrainian incursion into Russia, there's added momentum. Zelensky's got the world stage. He's shown that he can actually take the fight to Russia. And therefore, he desperately needs all the weapons he can get. Now, up till now, the Brits have been very good at saying, largely, we'll give you the weapons, you can use them as you see fit. And initially, that was believed to be what was happening with these Storm Shadow missiles, 200 miles range. They can target well inside Russian territory, even though America has been really clear not to do that. But of course, there are concerns now that Ukraine is actually operating inside Russian territory. And the Americans, the Brits, the French, and a couple of others have said we ought to have a coherent line here, because the danger is that you play into President Putin's agenda that says that he's not fighting a war against Ukraine. He's actually fighting one against the West or NATO. And if these weapons start being used, and that's why Keir Starmer has had to just row back slightly. And Boris Zelensky, who's in that same speech the other night, he did say, thank you so much to the UK, particularly for leaning into this. But please, please, please remove these restrictions on these long-range weapons.
But we've had this over the last 2.5 years. Each time, Zelensky's asking for more weapons and to be able to use them in this or that way. And eventually, it does seem the West does relent. And obviously, there are big issues going up to the American presidential election in terms of, Trump hasn't been so supportive over Ukraine and whether or not they were going to get that help. But it does seem that this is a key moment. We contrast what's happening in Ukraine and right now with last summer, when there was this sort of, this fight back that just never really materialised. They are sort of, pushing Russia onto retreat. Big humiliation for Vladimir Putin. We should be helping. I mean, Vladimir Putin already claims that he's at war with the West and it's an attack by the West. So have we got anything left to lose?
Well, yeah, we're dancing a little bit on the head of a needle here, and rather than sensationalise, you're absolutely right. We've provided anti-tank weapons, then we lent in and provided Challenge 2 tanks, then it was about long-range weapons, and then F-16s. They've just arrived as well. But one of the things that Putin has been very about is saber rattling, particularly around that sort of nuclear saber. And the West has largely seen that as a bluff. The challenge, of course, is that Russia has not been invaded, we call it an incursion, but invaded since 1941, Operation Barbarossa. President Putin paints himself as Mr. Security. Now, all of a sudden, his nation has been invaded as a direct result. Over 100,000, potentially up to 200,000 people have had to be displaced. Even though Putin tries to control the news agenda in Russia, it's going to be very difficult to stop that message getting out. And therefore, if you push harder, the danger is that forces Putin into a corner. I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying our leadership is just a bit nervous. You talked about elections. It isn't just the US elections. The German elections around the corner. During the British elections this year, Ukraine fell off the radar. It's very difficult for Ukraine to maintain its high profile in the media when elections are happening.
No, and also, the sheer amount of weaponry that they need fighting day to day. When we look at, I was reading yesterday, the losses that the Russians have had, the hundreds of thousands. It's just extraordinary, the scale of this battle. Ukraine is very small compared to Russia, but it's still a huge country, and Russians have taken vast swathes of land, or not the majority. Look at it, it's still on their edges. But do you think there's any possibility that this incursion into Russia by the Ukrainian forces, and they're saying, look, they want to try and hold on to this land, they're not just doing it and going, look, we've done it, bit of humiliation for Putin and we're coming out. They're trying to sort of reinforce that this is a move towards some sort of negotiation table, and where they've actually got a bit more to negotiate with. They've got prisoners of war, they'll have territory, Russian territory themselves, and that actually this could bring us closer to peace?
It could do, Julia, but I have to say these grey hairs mean that I would be immensely sceptical about that as an outcome. I don't think Putin is going to find himself forced to negotiating table. He will seek to have a ruthless response to this. The challenge, originally, we heard a couple of days ago, he was moving troops down from Kaliningrad, which is way up north near Lithuania, and also Crimea. The trouble is none of those are battle-hardened troops. They take a long time to get there and probably won't solve it. The main way of solving it will be to bring battle-hardened war-hardened troops from the front line down the Donbass up. That would relieve pressure. I think what's interesting is that
and it will also that will help the Ukrainian forces, obviously, because they're facing less of a threat on their own territory.
No, absolutely right. And of course, what we're seeing, remember those 2 bridges that were blown over the last couple of days? That gave an insight into what Ukraine's going to do. If they were going to expand further, they'd have left those bridges intact.
And the third, and Moscow has confirmed a 3rd bridge was taken as well.
Yeah, and this is all part and parcel, I suspect. I mean, we're hearing drip feeding. Let's face it, this Ukraine operation is a top-secret operation, well-planned, clearly a lot of intelligence. So we are having to piece together what's going on. It looks unlikely they're going to move further out. They've got probably 10,000 troops. They do not want to lose that many. I suspect what's going to happen is a graceful withdrawal when Russia puts a ruthless push in. Then Putin will be left with looking at a 1,200-mile border going, where's Ukraine going to strike next? And if he's going to maintain border security, he's got to take troops from the front line. That will inevitably play to the Ukrainian agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we talk about peace talks there. You're not hopeful. I say I'm not that hopeful. I would just like to ask. But talking of peace talks going on in the Middle East as well, I know you keep abreast of events in the Middle East as well. Again, this question marks about who is pushing for peace, who isn't, who is being stubborn. I mean, I think both sides probably given that what Hamas want and what the Israeli government want are completely and utterly the opposite of each other. What do you think the chances are there will be a deal done?
Unfortunately, Julia, again, I refer back to my earlier comment of grey hair and being around a bit. I've watched these peace talks fall storms over. In principle, in a military organised situation, you only get peace talks if both sides are motivated. Either one of them has won or they've ground themselves to a stalemate. Neither of those situations have happened here. Prime Minister Netanyahu appears to be hell-bent on making sure that every last Hamas fighter is killed. And from the Hamas perspective, they want the Palestinian question to be answered. And if that's not being answered, they're not interested in talking. The one thing that's different this time is that, remember, on the 31st of July, that outrageous attack that killed the leader of Hamas and has left Yahya Sinwar in charge. Iran is holding its finger on the trigger about reacting and said, if you don't come to a deal, we will launch that. And I suspect that's putting incredibly increased pressure from the international community onto Benjamin Netanyahu's shoulders. But bluntly, I'm not holding my breath at the moment.
No, indeed. Sure, Belt, great to get your analysis.